Both wild and urban, this walkway, perched 9 meters above the ground, has become one of the symbols of New York. It is made of steel and wild grasses, and it takes pedestrians on a journey among the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Who would have thought that this 2.4-kilometre-long green roof would serve as a benchmark for today's urban gardens? Welcome to the High Line. Nowadays, all New Yorkers take this elevated garden for granted, but 15 years ago, plans to create a green space in the air seemed like madness. The High Line rests on a ruin, an ancient railway line saved from demolition at the 11th hour. This is the Green team who won the competition launched by the city to restore this wasteland. Co-founder and director of Friends of the High Line, Robert Hammond. Architects Elizabeth Diller and Riccardo Scofidio, Director of Horticulture Andy Pettis, Landscape Architect Isabel Castilla, and Landscape Architect and Urban Designer James Corner, who brought this crack team together.
The High Line is a bit like a film. It's all about duration, seeing it, the same things in different ways every time. It's a remarkable journey, a remarkable scenography.
A place of slowness, voyeurism, a place unlike any other place in New York City.
When the park first opened, we used to get questions a lot like, why is it all weeds? Where are the flowers? Where are the plants? Is this the garden?
It's a street in the air. It's a non-street. It's a traffic jam, basically.
We never thought this could be that successful. You know, we thought maybe 100,000 people would come. Last year, we had 7.8 million.
Its success is down to their common vision to build on what made this railway line so magical, to highlight the brutality of this former industrial landscape and to make it accessible without destroying its authenticity. The work was split into 3 phases and spread over 10 years.
When I first stepped onto the High Line, it was a total surprise. You were very struck by serenity and peace, and quiet, and the length of this green meadow going for 1.5 miles, just cutting and slicing through the city, literally. So it's a very, very powerful impression. And so as a designer, we sort of said, this is so fabulous. Let's not try to invent something totally new. Let's try to work with what we have. And that's where the philosophy came. Keep it wild, keep it simple, keep it quiet, and keep it slow. Because those 4 characteristics were the characteristics that we found here, the characteristics that we wanted to be able to retain in a very magical, very poetic way.
On the banks of the Hudson River, in the meatpacking district where New York's abattoirs used to be located, a riveted steel platform rises up towards the sky among the buildings on Gansevoort Street. A giant photograph appears further along the High Line on the buildings opposite to remind us of its former use. Our journey begins on this long staircase with views over New York from the south to the north of the city.
Because that's also your first staircase onto the High Line, it also brings you up from this tough street below, and you come up and you find yourself in this woodland, in this stand of trees, mostly birch with some aspen and maple, under a massive sky. It's a very, very surprising moment. A lot of the High Line is not visible to the street. It's mid-block and surrounded by buildings. But that southern end, the elevation of the High Line is open to the street. And so we wanted to have a very lush planting up there. Keep the street level tough. It's granite, concrete, no trees, no plants. And up on the High Line would be a floating garden. So that really is about theatricalizing the beginning.
But before James Corner and his team came up with this contemporary design, the project would never have seen the light of day without the determination of two New Yorkers, Joshua David and Robert Hammond. On discovering the railway line in 1999, they founded an association called Friends of the High Line, which today brings together 200 volunteers. For years, their association battled to save this structure from demolition. Robert Hammond tells us the extraordinary story of this place.
The railroad ran down on 10th Avenue, and it was a freight line, and it ran on the street, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the trains. So in the 1920s, they decided to elevate it about 30 feet in the air. And it was always a freight line, actually literally brought cows and carcasses in by train. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less in the 1960s and 50s. And the last train rode in 1980, a trainload of frozen turkeys for Thanksgiving. And then it was abandoned. I love the structure from the street, you know, the rusty, the steel, this industrial relic. But then you came up and there was 1.5 miles of wildflowers. I mean, it was just magical, right in the middle of New York City. Almost no one had ever seen. And at the time, we didn't really know what it should be. And so we thought, you know, New Yorkers should decide.
In 2004, a competition was launched, challenging people to devise a future use for this railway line. 720 entrants from 38 countries presented the jury with all sorts of novel ideas.
My favorite two were a mile-long lap pool and an urban roller coaster. But they weren't, you know, realistic. It was really just to create awareness.
The challenge for our green team lay in keeping it simple, whilst creating a walkway which was out of the ordinary.
One of the big challenges was, of course, how to make a path. And the dimensions of the High Line are so tight that if we just had one big path, it would be a very crude experience. So we had this idea that you would have this path and landscape, but then you would have a series of places or episodes nested within it. So as you move from segment to segment, you're experiencing difference, but they all feel like they're part of the same train track.
In 2009, this first section of the High Line opened to the public. The landscape is constantly changing as it passes among buildings, through covered passageways and out into open spaces, where New Yorkers like to take a rest and prolong the experience, sunbathing with their feet in the water. It is all designed to take people out of the urban jungle and show them how lush this place used to be, such as this junction, where the railway disappears into a tangle of flowers and grasses. Not far from here, the highlight of the walkway is this amphitheatre, where people out for a stroll can sit on the wooden steps and look out over 10th Avenue. The architects have created a spectacular urban theatre here, removing the steel and replacing it with glass so that people can watch and wait.
This place is the essence of the High Line. As productive city dwellers, we're always doing something. Either we're working at our desks, and if we're not doing that, we're shopping or we're burning calories at the gym. At the High Line, you really can't do anything but walk and sit. You can't bring your dog, you can't ride a bicycle, you can't throw a ball. You really can't do anything but sit and watch people. Also, you can look into people's windows, and sometimes that view is two-way. People know they're being watched. And we thought that inside of that very, very limited palette of opportunities, there would be something even more special, which is sitting and actually looking at nothing. And so this was really the theory of the project. And we're basically over 10th Avenue. This was always here. Nobody ever noticed it. And today we can sit and look at the traffic going uptown and look at the taillights of cars and trucks. And to look at something that's very familiar, so ordinary, even boring, but in an unfamiliar way, is something that's captured people's imaginations. This is very much part of the keep it simple strategy, that everything is already here. We only had to tweak what was already there, and we simply had to look at it in a slightly different way, through a different lens. The High Line started with a lot of different ideas about features that could happen along the mile and a half. There could be a theater, there could be a place for film, there could be a place for dancing. And then we started to think that maybe less is more here. So smaller moves, what was really essential? And the most important thing was really the paving. The landscape and the paving come together. So it's not a normal New York street where pedestrians have the right of way. Here, plants have the right of way. So the way that we designed it is that these pavers start to snake into areas of green vegetation. So areas that are meant for the public or meant for plants is not so defined. When you go into the street and you look at a concrete sidewalks, very often you will find cracks and you'll find grass growing through the cracks. Nature is always going to win. So we were very much inspired by this thing that happens, which is usually thought of as decay. It's usually the end of a cycle. But in fact, it's the beginning of the growth.
We did not want the High Line to appear manicured. So avoiding hedges and boxwoods and roses. So the whole idea of keep it wild was to learn from the planting that was sort of here naturally, to diversify that even more, and to create a very, very wild sense of nature.
Our journey continues through a landscape inspired by the melancholic and rebellious beauty of the High Line. Here, the planting has been carefully orchestrated by Dutchman Piet Aldorf, known worldwide for his expertise with grasses and perennials. The High Line team immediately thought of him as someone who could preserve the spirit of the place, whilst bringing to it the wild abundance of the great prairies of the Midwest. In other words, 115,000 plants and 600 species, half of which come from North America. It is a typically American landscape, and Director of Horticulture Andy Pettis has a particular fondness for it.
This is one of my favorite grasses on the High Line. It's Panicum virgatum shenandoah. And I really love it because it has these beautiful panicles of airy seed heads that create kind of a screen that you can view the other plants through, but then it also has this gorgeous burgundy color to it. Another of my favorites is this taller grass, Andropogon girardii. And this plant, it gets to be 6 to 8 feet tall, really imposing, and it's fun to see a grass of that scale when we're really not used to it. You know, we're used to thinking of grasses as very diminutive plants. This is another grass that Pete Udolph uses in his matrix, or the mix of plants that kind of create the base of his designs. It's called Sparobulus heterolepis, or prairie dropseed is the common name that we use in the United States. And these plants together are 3 of the plants that make up 4 plants that really are sort of the staple grasses of the tall grass prairies of the Midwest of the United States. They're referred to as the 4 horsemen of the prairies. In this garden, a lot of these plants sort of migrate and move and change. So what we're really looking for is a balance of color and shape and proportions between the grasses and the flowering plants. So what we do is a lot of gardening by elimination. So we edit the plantings a lot. If one plant is really seeming to take over in a way that we don't want it to, we'll rein it back in. lots of challenges with the structure and the environment itself and growing plants here. There's only about 18 inches of soil in most of the garden, so the soil is very shallow in most areas. But what we found is that rather than the roads growing down, they grow out, so that we can actually grow very tall trees. Asters are really well known for blooming in the fall. So it's important to have flowers that bloom at this time of year in your garden to sustain the pollinators through the season. You need some late blooming plants like this. One of the things that Pete Udolph really emphasizes in his gardens is using the entire life cycle of the plant. So the skeleton of the plant, as he calls it, is just as important as the flower. He was really looking for a way to honor nature and to emulate nature. You know, create an artist's perception of nature. It exists as theater, so it's changing from day to day and week to week.
There are 10 staircases placed along the length of the High Line, and New Yorkers never tire of coming into this garden because it is in a state of perpetual flux. The landscape and the street furniture are constantly changing, and yet the slogan is, keep it slow. With that in mind, there are works of art dotted along the walkway, inciting contemplation, such as this huge painted canvas level with 22nd Street. This is where the second phase of the High Line's construction begins, and it is here that we find architect Riccardo Scofidio perched on the recycled teak steps.
It was critical that we dampen that speed, we slow that speed down. We didn't want people coming up and bringing the pace of the city up to the High Line. And so one of our first acts in terms of stairs coming up, we called it the slow stairs. And we extended the stair and brought you up so that you started to look at the structure. You were kind of engulfed in the structure. It began to take that urban speed out of your legs, so that when you came up onto the High Line, you might begin to stroll. You might begin to walk at a pace that's not typical for the city pace. What we did here was we installed a green grass lawn, which was absolutely atypical and foreign to the High Line. Grass and greenery is incredibly sensual. The scent, the aroma, when you cut grass, the smell of it is amazing. When you're up on the High Line, particularly in that first section, to be able to involve yourself with the plants. And realizing that, we said we will give them a lawn, we'll give them something to roll on and to enjoy in the second section.
The lawn happens to be where there was a very sunny spot and where the High Line actually got a little wider, but it sort of warranted that in that location. And then we have one of my favorite elements is the flyover, which is the elevated catwalk that takes you through a stand of magnolia trees in between two very, very tall, close buildings. That was inspired by, again, my first visit up here, where there was a stand of trees growing in that location originally because the buildings created so much shade that it was shady and damp, and the trees grew up in that location, and it was magical. So that's really the only place along the High Line where you have this sense of strong enclosure, being in trees, in between buildings in a very tight space of compression.
One of the sources of inspiration for this reconversion was the Promenade Plantée in Paris. That park, today renamed Coulée Vert, also rests on a former railway track, which was restored in 1988. The 4.5-kilometre-long disused railway line was a precursor to the High Line, and the first time an obsolete transport infrastructure had been turned into a lush garden.
Promenade Plantée is just a straight walk. It's just a speed walk. It's like a highway. There's no reason to pause and slow down. So one of the important things was that there should be no more than 50% hardscape, the surface you walk on. And in doing that, it meant that the person who came up here didn't feel that the walk was here for them, dominating like an express highway going through the countryside.
I think the Promenade Plantée itself is very Parisian, and it's very beautiful, and it's very detached from the city. It's trying to make a garden a very peaceful atmosphere. This is distinctly New York. It's very kind of nasty, and it's gritty, and it's in this industrial area, and it crosses inside of buildings and past chimneys, in front of fire escapes, and along orientations that are not necessarily like a gridiron in the way that New York is organized. So you see things obliquely, and you see new views that you could never imagine. You know, just in back of us, you could have a view of the Statue of Liberty. You would never think that you could see it from this point in Manhattan. It's the unofficial side of New York that I think people find fascinating.
Might have become a benchmark for other railway track-to-garden conversions around the world, but it is constantly evolving. For now, this is where it ends, north of Manhattan on 34th Street. This final section, which curves around the city's train terminus, was opened in 2014 and project managed by Isabel Castillo. Here, the city reasserts itself, especially as far as the ambient sounds are concerned.
The High Line for us is more of a different way of understanding and engaging with the city. So the idea of keeping it quiet is more about perceiving those sounds of the city. This area where we have helicopters versus perhaps other areas where it's more about cars or people, and being more of a city experience rather than you yourself doing a lot more activities. For this portion of the High Line, we decided to keep its existing structure at a minimal touch, while keeping the existing vegetation that basically located itself on the High Line tracks untouched, so that we were not really altering that unique and existing ecology. That ecology continues to evolve because we're so close to the river. So a lot of wind brings in seeds, so it's kind of a unique natural garden. We kept all the rail tracks where they were, and we located this paving system on top. It's porous, so it allows all the rainwater to basically percolate through the paving and go on to the planting beds. The context of the city changes around a lot, so we always try to make sure the design reflects that. Here we have this contrast of these very high structures against a very open sky. So the design also remains very low so that you get that sense of horizon from the city skyline. Really around us, the entire area is developing dramatically. So the other reason why we kept this very simple is in contrast to that development. So it's a place where you really see nature at its best in the middle of New York City.
It's not just about building a park or an open space. It's also how do people use it. Nature, I think, gives you a different experience with other people. It makes you more friendly. It makes you a little bit happier.
Since New York is the city that never sleeps, the walk has to be completed by night.
Your eyes adjust to the dark so you can see the city. The planting is lit. And, you know, to me, that's the most magical time.